Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's 8 Eyes, the Castlevania conversion. Now this is a ROM hack of one of my all-time favorite games, 8 Eyes, and it's been converted into a more traditional Castlevania game. 8 Eyes is one of the games I'm most passionate about when it comes to retro gaming. It's one of my all-time favorites. I love the music that goes along with the game, and I just love everything about it. It's something that a lot of people probably don't appreciate because this game isn't really that great in so many different ways, but it's a game that I will forever love, and it's one of the games that I have speedrun so much and am kind of known for. If there's any game I'm known for speedrunning, it's definitely 8 Eyes. Now this version of 8 Eyes converts the game into Castlevania using Simon Belmont, and you still have your Falcon with you. I don't know if they've supposedly changed maybe the name of it, because of course Simon Belmont doesn't have the Falcon, but Cuttress is still with us. He's blue now in this conversion, and because of some of the changing of graphical colors and such, some of the enemy palettes have been completely changed. For example, some of the ones that you'll notice throughout the course of the game are red. Also, a few other enemies have been changed up completely, but not too many as you're making it farther into it. Most of the enemies still remain the same from their original 8 Eyes versions. Now, if you're unfamiliar with 8 Eyes, the entire premise of the game is you are playing as the hero Orin. In this case, we're playing as Simon Belmont, I guess, and your goal is to travel along the world to travel to many locations and obtain the 8 Eyes, which are treasures that were found at the bottom of nuclear bomb sites. It's a post-apocalyptic game, which is just one of the many reasons I love it so much. And your goal is to find these gems that are being held by the certain leaders of these countries, and then take them all to one place known as the Pedestal of Peace, and thus will restore peace, because then all the countries are reunited as all the gems are in one place. It's a weird idea, weird concept, something I would love to see further, expanded upon in a sequel or another style of game using a very similar premise. Now, the game has a Mega Man-like quality that you're supposed to beat it in a certain order, because every time you beat a boss, you'll get a new sword, or in this case, it's a whip, though the icon is still a sword. They still talk about swords. They didn't change that part of the game's story or anything like that. But either way, you start off with a sword that's best against the Spain boss, who we're fighting now. And then, when you beat him, you'll get a new sword, which is best against the Egypt boss, and then so on and so forth. I'll be beating the game in the traditional order. You'll also notice when I make it to the end of the game, you do a boss rush, I'll be doing less damage to the bosses during that segment, because I don't have the whip, or sword, that's most strong against them. Now, because of this conversion and changes, instead of using your item meter, normally in 8 Eyes, you collect crosses from the enemies that you end up defeating. In this game, though, because it's Castlevania based, you collect, of course, traditional hearts to use as your sub-weapons. All the sub-weapons have been changed up to traditional Castlevania ones, so I don't end up getting the snowball or the crystal that I can use the freeze bosses in place. So in fact, being somebody who is an expert at this game and has speedrun it a million times, it actually makes the game tougher in some regards because you don't have certain weaponry at your disposal, though the holy water and the cross still do a good job as far as weapons are concerned when it comes to defeating the various bosses. One thing though that is a bit annoying is switches don't seem to be able to be hit by the various new sub-weapons. Now this may be due to the fact they still have the hit detection properties of their other weapon counterparts. In this version, instead of the crystal, you end up getting the cross. And that switch right there that I just hit to open the door, which is one of the big things about 8 Eyes, you have a lot of switches you'll have to hit in order to go through doors, and you have a very limited time to do so before the door ends up closing, and then you have to hit the switch again. But the sub-weapons don't end up hitting those switches, so a couple of parts because of that ends up being a bit more difficult in this version. It's kind of funny that turning this game into Castlevania should in many ways make it easier, and it probably does to the average game player. It probably makes it more playable than, of course, originally 8 Eyes is, because of the weapon in the original game being such a short sword to use against them. However, for me, it's actually giving a new challenge to the game because there are so many differences and changes. Now, for this boss, he jumps around the room firing out 3 projectiles every time that he ends up kind of seeing you before he ends up then walking and jumping again. There are many different strategies to kind of avoid him, but of course you can sometimes actually deflect or destroy his fireballs that he fires out. You can kind of use the bird as a distraction. For most bosses in the game, it'll actually kind of like distract them. Bosses may end up attacking them instead of attacking you for a second, giving you an opportunity to lay in a few hits. Another thing that's different because of this version is the health regenerating items, as well as the items that normally would extend your health bar or your item bar aren't usable. Basically, they just become unusable. You can pick them up, but they don't end up having any effect on the game whatsoever. Normally, at the top of the screen, you have your item bar, your health, as well as Cuttress's health, the Falcon's health. But the Falcon's health is represented by the blue sphere in the right side of the screen. One thing that 8 Eyes I loved about it was you could easily carry more than one sub-weapon at a time, or more than one weapon at a time, and you can change between those weapons by pressing the select button, which is something that would have been awesome to be able to do in the earlier Castlevania titles, but of course Castlevania 2 is the only one that would allow you to have multiple weapons in your inventory at a given time. Thankfully, one thing that this conversion or hack didn't change up was the two most important hidden items. Just like Castlevania, you find a lot of hidden items in the walls, including hints for how to solve the final puzzle of the game. At the end of the game, you actually have to put the 8 eyes or jewels into a pedestal in the correct order, and if you don't do so, you have to keep trying until either you give up or eventually you do it, and that's the only way you can actually end up getting the ending to the game. However, there are a few other things in the walls, like I mentioned earlier, the health, as well as the item that would extend your health meter, which doesn't work in this version, but the two items that are most important are the one that makes you invincible for a period of time, represented by the classic water pitcher like it would be in the original Castlevania, and then there's the item that powers you up. It makes you stronger and allows you to do double damage for a period of time, and for bosses that you already have the correct weapon against, it actually allows you to do 4 times the damage. And there's a couple of bosses where you're able to do that against them and really defeat them quickly. Now, this is one of the toughest bosses in the game normally. Most people will probably get to this boss and immediately be destroyed because not only of his panther pet, but because he's hard to get to. He runs away from you, throws cards consistently at you, and knocks you away from him. The whip, of course, helps out, but there's also, like I grabbed, the invincibility bottle. This will allow you to easily defeat him and to be able to move on to the next stage. One of the things that also helps out with that boss is the room beforehand, right between that skeleton at the top where the kind of like two panthers can kind of meet in the middle. There is a breakable block there that has health, but like I said, the health works a bit weird in this version as far as it comes to regenerating your health. In fact, it kind of brings your health back to half health automatically. But it ends up sometimes giving me less health because of I had more than half of my health. It's weird, but it's something that I don't think was ever, fixed or improved upon after the ROM hack was originally released. Here's a good example of a speedrun tactic of hitting the switch and recalling the bird quickly so that you're able to get to the door. It's very easy to do that in this version because the whip allows you to hit that enemy, but normally if you end up getting hit by that enemy right before that door, it's just enough time to cause you to miss the door and have it close on you, which if I'm speedrunning the game, that would actually be an instant reset. I would have to stop and start the game over again because of missing that door. As you just saw, though, a few seconds ago was where that location of one of the health replenishment jars was, which isn't all that useful. Also, there's a few enemies in the game that can only be killed by the bird, but that has been changed for this version, making those enemies easily killed by the whip, just a single shot from the whip. So that's something that normally wouldn't end up happening. The enemy I just defeated, that skeleton that was throwing stuff, isn't an enemy normally in 8 Eyes. In fact, it's a weird-looking guy who is throwing out those rocks or snowballs out at him and trying to hit you. So they changed that one up, but it's one of the only enemies in this version that got changed up. Now, for the India boss, he disappears and reappears various locations trying to attack you. At the very beginning of his room, though, is a Z-jar, which is the thing that allows you to do double damage, or in this case, because of the better weapon, 4 times damage. So I'm able to take out an entire thing of his health in one single shot. Now, unfortunately, it runs out relatively quickly, so you have a very small window, and normally we would use that jar combined with the snowballs that ends up freezing the enemy or boss in place to really wail on him and defeat him quickly. The next level of the game is Africa, which is actually the shortest level because it's a maze level. The next two levels, both Africa and Germany, are both the only two maze-like levels in the game, and you have to follow the exact path to get through them. Because of this, though, Africa ends up being an extremely short level. With most of the level, you don't have to adventure through or take out the other enemies. In fact, right up this staircase that I'm about to go up is actually the very end of the level, and we're already at the boss. That's how short this level ends up being when you know how to make it through that maze, but of course the trick is figuring out the maze. For the Africa boss, jumping over here and breaking open this wall will allow you to find one of the G jars. Now this makes you invincible for a period of time, and this will allow us to kind of run over and destroy this boss pretty quickly, but it doesn't last forever, so eventually we may end up getting hit a few times. The thing that's funny though is the African boss, his weapon is what does damage. Getting hit by his body will still hurt you, but it won't do that much damage. But if you get hit by one of his axes, it does significant damage. In a speedrun, we actually skip that health jar a lot of times and just go straight after the boss. And if you time it right, you can still defeat him even without the crystal or snowball to slow him up, and without that invincibility. At the beginning of the Germany level, we make a big leap over to the center, falling through a very small gap in the middle of the floor. This allows us to skip about half of the level because of this. It's a very tough jump to make normally with Auron, but because of the change of the sprite and changing up of the jumping mechanic in this version of the game, it makes that jump particularly a little bit easier to make it across. But it's a good strategy and definitely a big time saver and one of the earliest tricks that was discovered as far as being able to speed through some of the levels here in 8 Eyes. Because it's another one of the maze-like levels, with you going through things and all that kind of stuff, it actually has one of the craziest endings because of this. We'll fall through the left floor here and actually appear out the top. It's one of the weirdest things about the game, but I've always loved that. And now, we're at the boss chamber already. At the beginning of the boss chamber is another one of the Z jars to give us 4 times the damage, but we have to jump over his attacks while he's trying to get him out at us. It's really easy to jump over him in this version and allow us to get close and deal a lot of damage to him really quick. He'll go down in just a few seconds. While at the end of the game, all the bosses end up being refightable as part of the boss rush, the German boss is the only one who does not appear in the House of Ruth level, the final level of the game. Though there is actually another room in the game that isn't used during the House of Ruth, which had to be originally his boss chamber, but for some reason they just didn't implement it as far as making the game. I've always wondered if that was intentional, or did they just accidentally warp you to the wrong door from one door to another when it came to mapping out the final level of the game. Unfortunately, the company that made the game only made a very, very small handful of stuff, so unfortunately they don't have a ton of legacy, and while 8 Eyes is no means a masterpiece, it still is one of my favorite games, and I would love to have seen more games in the same style and a sequel that was improved upon as far as gameplay mechanics were concerned to make a better playing and game that could have become a classic on the NES, or at least a hidden gem style of game. It's always hard to recommend 8 Eyes to other people just because it honestly isn't the best playing in its original form, though this ROM hack definitely makes it more playable to the average NES gamer. I will also say, of course, that if you haven't been listening at all during, by talking, of course, through most of the game, do yourself a favor and go listen to the soundtrack outside of this video, and just give it a listen if you're a big fan of retro game music. I'm sure you will find a few tracks within its soundtrack that are pretty impressive and really great music overall. I would love to hear remixes of the music, but there really isn't any remixes or any kind of community that likes 8 Eyes, so I'm not surprised there's really not that many things about it. The composer of the soundtrack actually only did this game. From my research that I did, I can only really find a very small bit of information about the composer, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like he did any other game music. He only did the music for this game. Now here we are at the Arabian Boss, which is one of the tougher bosses. He has 3 different attacks that he can do. 2 are sword swipes and 1 is a knife throw. Now he does them in the same order every time, so you can kind of, scope out what he's about to do next and get ready, as well as the bird is great for this fight. He's a great distraction and will definitely allow you to get a few more hits in than maybe you normally would. Though, of course, on a normal playthrough of the game, I would have that crystal to slow him up a bit to allow me to get a few extra hits. Now, this room got changed up a lot. In fact, they even added a whip upgrade, giving you the fire whip. Now, I'm unsure if you're able to find the fire whip in this ROM hack outside of the final level. It actually caught me off guard the first time I actually made it to the House of Ruth in this ROM hack using this particular gameplay. But the fire whip is a much farther longer whip for this one, making the boss rush at the end a lot easier. In fact, without it, this boss rush would be relatively tough because you consistently get full items to use. As you can see, I have 99 hearts in the corner, but because I don't have the crystal, I don't really use it a whole lot, but I found while playing through that I can use the holy water on a couple of the bosses during this boss rush to really end up helping me out, and it kind of works almost as good, not quite as good, but almost as good as the crystal would in a normal playthrough. The third boss that you end up rematching against is the Arabian Boss, and one thing that I did find out in this version that you can do more so than in the original 8 Eyes is actually duck and avoid a lot more of his attacks. Normally ducking right near him, a lot of times you still end up getting hit or clipped by his sword when he's swinging it around, and along with the distance that the whip ends up covering, it still makes this a pretty easy fight. Though normally when I'd be playing through this, the Arabia fight, the rematch, is one of the tougher ones when it comes to the House of Ruth boss rush. Now, next up is usually one of the easiest for me when it comes to the boss rush, but in this version ends up being more difficult, and that is the rematch here, and against the Italy boss, who ends up throwing those cards and can really keep you at bay with them. It's hard to destroy him with the whip, though when I get a little bit low on health, I can pull out the holy water and use that to kind of help me out. You can duck under some of the cards, but it doesn't really end up working all that well. Normally, you would end up having the crystal ball, the snowball, and can freeze him in place to allow you to kind of get up close and do a lot of hits, but in this version, as you'll see, the holy water ends up doing a pretty good job of kind of freezing him just enough so I'm able to kind of get a couple extra hits in and be able to beat him. Now, every boss chamber also does have a health container within it, so you just kind of have to locate it and find it, but they all do. The rematch against the India boss is actually the one that kind of decides how a speed run is going to go, because with the crystal and the less amount of damage that you're able to do to him, your goal is to make sure that he doesn't teleport very often, and it's very hard to do so, but in a speed run, the normal 8 Eyes, you can actually get him to go through only one cycle where he won't even be able to teleport, though it's very, very hard to do so and takes a lot of precise timing and moving to actually be able to manipulate him the way that to get that to work, but it is something doable, though it's not something, obviously, I'm going to be able to pull off in a version like this. It's still a pretty easy fight, because most of his shots are going to just fly over your head, and with the long reach of the whip, he ends up still being really easy. It takes longer than most other bosses, but it's an easy fight. Now here is the rematch against the Africa boss, which once again can be difficult. I can use the holy water if I want to kind of freeze him, but a lot of times I can still just kind of hit him from a good distance. Most of his attacks, other than the ones that he throws axes out at you, which are sporadic. Most of this game is precision, not RNG, or random number generator, which means randomness in general is a speedrunning thing that comes up a lot. But most of this game isn't that way. It's very much your skill level will dictate what ends up happening. But when it comes to the Africa boss and the kind of method it comes to his throwing axes, it's one of the few things that's actually completely random or very, very hard to manipulate, if even at all possible. Now here we go with the final boss of the game. This is Ruth, one of the coolest final bosses, just because back then, in the NES days, there weren't many female characters in NES titles, let alone a female final boss, making her one of the coolest female NES-era characters, like, ever, in my opinion. But of course, many people never really beat 8 Eyes, so they probably really have never seen her, but she's so awesome, like, skull on the top of her head, plus the fact that she uses a whip. Pretty cool stuff. So anyway, always love Ruth. Definitely one of my favorite final bosses of any NES game of all time. Once she's defeated, though, we grab the jewel, the last jewel, and now we go to the Pedestal of Peace, where we're going to be able to put in all of the jewels. Like I said, you have to do it in a very certain order, but at this point, I kind of have it memorized. It also has its own kind of little pattern to it that you'll kind of notice here, just the way that the ends end up working, and then plop in the final 2 in the center. And if you've done it correctly, the whole screen shakes, there's an opening, and then you meet the Guardian dude. This weird gargoyle-esque guy who ends up kind of talking to you. He even has kind of a cross on his forehead. One of the weirdest kind of endings to a game. A lot of NES games didn't even have an ending, usually just like, congratulations. But not only does this one have congratulations to Orin, the main character, but then also has a lot of text that it kind of like thanks you. I've always wondered what the original Japanese text ended up translating to, because in the Japanese version of the game, there isn't the same kind of ending. It's the same picture and everything, but obviously the text is different. I've always wondered how different it was compared to the North American version. Also, there are 3 difficulties to the North American version. The version that we just played now, the normal version, and then there's a hard and a very hard mode. In Japan, though, there's only the hard and very hard modes to the game. There is no normal difficulty that was created just for the North American audience. One of the many weird things about NES games as far as localization and moving it from one region to another, there are so many games that got easier from their Japanese version, and then a bunch of games that got harder from their original Japanese version. And it's always kind of funny to see those differences, because a lot of people will say, well, they always made it harder for North America, but honestly, that wasn't always the case, with 8 Eyes being one example, and of course the Adventures of Bayou Billy being the other big example, where they made our version, the North American version, so much harder than the original Japanese. So there you guys have it, though. There is 8 Eyes, the Castlevania conversion. I like what they did with it. It makes sense. 8 Eyes looks like Castlevania, but if you've ever played it, it's one of those things where it doesn't play like a traditional Castlevania. If you ever thought Castlevania games were difficult, 8 Eyes is definitely as difficult, if not harder, in many regards to the original Castlevania. The only thing it doesn't have that makes Castlevania so much more difficult in so many ways is the knockback into pits. You don't have to worry about pits and being knocked back into them in 8 Eyes, which is such a blessing, honestly. As much as there's negativity and badness when it comes to 8 Eyes itself, like, that's one of the big pluses. But yeah, this is one of my favorite games of all time. I love it. I talk about it often when I talk about speedrunning and just my love for retro games, a lot of fond memories. It's one of the few boxed games that I kind of keep separate from my collection. I always have it up on my shelf, and it's just, I love 8 Eyes. It's just one of those weird gems on the NES for me that I played a lot as a kid that I have so many fond memories with. But anyway, guys, that's going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a thumbs up or commenting down below. If you enjoyed this Castlevania conversion of 8 Eyes, maybe check out my Versus Castlevania, the arcade version of the original Castlevania that I did earlier this week. Or if you want something a little bit different, you can check out my world record speedrun of 8 Eyes. Now, it was from a live stream. I almost break down at the end of it because I was so happy to get my record back, and there is some bad language, but it's something that I think if you kind of enjoy this and want to see how the game can be speedrun, it's definitely worth looking at. I also need to thank all the members of my Patreon. Without your guys' continued support, I wouldn't be able to keep doing what I'm doing, so thank you all so much for that continued support. And I'd like to thank you guys so much for watching this video, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.